Okay, I think we can kick off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Themis intelligence briefing about illicit gold and its links to the Kremlin. My name is Nadia O'Shaughnessy, and I'm head of research at Themis. It's a real pleasure to be moderating today's session about what remains a relatively underexplored aspect of Putin's tactics. So let's just start with a bit of background information. The Kremlin has been strategically building up Russia's gold reserves since the 2014 invasion of Crimea. Nearly a decade later, this long game strategy does appear to be paying off. Russians are buying gold to protect their assets against the unstable ruble, and elites are relying on this universal currency to move their fortunes abroad. Looking forward, as the West closes loopholes in its sanctions regimes, there are likely to be attempts to launder gold assets through key gold trading hotspots in the Middle East and in Africa. So in today's briefing, we'll take a look at this life cycle of illicit gold in connection to the Putin regime from source to destination. I'm joined by my colleagues from the insight and intelligence teams at Themis to explore the role of gold as an economic and a political tool for Putin, but also as a potential money laundering and sanctions evasion mechanism. And we'll be using Themis Search to map out some of these networks. So just in terms of running order, the next half an hour of this session will take the form of a Q&A with our resident Themis experts, Elizabeth Humphrey, who is a financial crime researcher in the Insight team, and Henry Williams, our head of investigations. Elizabeth will share with you some of the key findings of our ongoing research into illicit gold, and then Henry will bring this to life with some key current case studies on our Themis Search platform. We'll then leave plenty of time, so 10 to 15 minutes, but can be longer as well, of audience Q&A. So please do send in any questions throughout the talk via the Zoom Q&A panel on your right-hand side of your screen. But just before we kick off, I wanted to ask everyone tuning in today an initial question to set the scene. So here is our audience poll, which you should see up on your screen. And the question we're asking today is, what percentage of Russian central bank holdings is in gold reserves? And you should be able to just easily tick one of the options on your screen. So whilst everyone takes a moment just to ponder this question, I think for context, it's also really interesting to note that Russia is actually the world's third largest gold producer at the moment, with its annual gold mine production at approximately 300 metric tons. And this Russian gold output has been rising steadily over the past few years and is actually now only surpassed by China and Australia. And a fun fact, so before Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing sanctions, the UK was actually by far the largest export destination for Russian gold. But anyway, I think most people have had the chance to vote now. So the results are coming in. Let's see what everyone thinks about Russia's central bank holdings. Interesting. So the last option, 28%, seems to be most popular. And this is, in fact, not the right answer, but it's close. So option D, 22%, was the correct one. So to be precise, in June 2021, last year, the proportion of Russia's central bank's reserves held in gold stood at 21.7%. Elizabeth will talk to us more about this later, but it's really interesting to note that this figure was actually at 8.9% in March 2014. So there's been quite a significant increase in gold reserves in Russia over the past decade, and a corresponding fall in US and European currency reserves. Before we get into the weeds of the Russia situation specifically, it'd be brilliant if you could provide us with a financial crime perspective, though, on some of these issues around gold, Elle, based on the research that you've been doing over the past few months on illicit gold and the gold trade. I'm particularly keen to know what role gold plays in facilitating illicit financial flows, and also why firms need to be wary of it as a supply chain risk, potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Themis, for having me to speak today. I'm so excited to be representing the Insight team along with Nadia. It's a fantastic opportunity to talk about some of our recent research. So really excited. But yeah, it's just as you requested to speak a bit about gold in a broad sense before we kind of get into the weeds about Russia. It really has historically been a natural target for illicit activity and financial flows. And particularly our research has been looking into flows from East Africa, primarily into the UAE and some other hubs, global hubs for illicit gold flows. But we're really seeing an increase in the flows of gold internationally. And it's really increased significantly over the past decade, particularly from that East Africa to Dubai linkage. So basically those changes made us want to look into what makes gold like that natural target, and indeed how certain regimes, including now the Putin government, are really taking advantage of these factors to pursue their agenda. And taking a deeper look at it, I think also from our perspective as a financial crime agency, prepares us well to be able to do due diligence on our supply chains from an illicit gold angle. So first off, I think it's interesting to look into some of the sort of attributes of gold that make it a strategic and easy target for smuggling. To start off, in most simply, I guess it's physically very conducive. It's small, it's easily concealable on person, or in cargo or carry-on luggage. We see that a lot, and it's also very easily anonymized through the refining process. So this makes it physically quite conducive, but it also has very strong status on the global market, as having universal value not only as a commodity but as a financial instrument, and having that really quite consistent strong demand. It's well known to be a sort of safe haven currency during times like these. So it's a good bet for in terms of investment. Makes it very conducive and popular for smuggling. And then also in terms of regulation, it's generally less regulated than other financial instruments because of its dual role as a currency as well as a commodity. It often gets treated as a commodity and therefore less regulated as a currency. And it obviously exists outside of that SWIFT digital system. So it's historically been harder to regulate for that reason, and remains the case today, definitely. It can just, go off the radar basically much more easily. And all of that makes it quite easy for, illicit actors to acquire gold and then move it through the international supply chain. So very important to look at. And just to give a sense geographically, typically illicit gold tends to be sourced from artisanal sources. So gold can be either industrially mined or artisanally mined. And a lot of that gold with illicit linkages we found is sourced artisanally from what you would call artisanal and small scale gold mining, or ASGM. And that's basically, where individuals or small groups of miners are either digging with very basic equipment or panning for gold in rivers. This is happening it's used as a seasonal or year-round livelihood for a huge number of people. So it's a very important developing economy. So it's important to consider that as we think about the intersection of development and illicit economies. But yeah, we see that across Latin America, across West, Central, East Africa. As I said, our research has been focusing on that mining in DRC and in Sudan, South Sudan. We see a lot coming out of there. And basically, as I said, it can start out as a livelihood activity, but then it can be quickly rendered illicit as it moves up the supply chain. So, there's many different ways it can be rendered illicit: money laundering, smuggling, informal taxation from armed groups, and involvement of key political elites, and that's a huge issue in terms of PEPs. And basically, that sort of commingling and crossover between illicit and licit points in the supply chain make it quite difficult for us to track illicit gold, basically, because it does transform sort of between licit and illicit as it goes up the supply chain. So basically, this makes it quite difficult to track, and also very conducive to money launderers. And then I think it's interesting because ultimately we've seen gold generally enter the global supply chain quite easily as a result. You know, it gets sanitized, particularly at sort of global hubs. And as I said, we've been looking a little bit at the UAE as one of those hubs in our own research, particularly with gold coming from East Africa. So basically, to paint a bit of a picture in terms of this, we might see gold that's inarticulately mined in, say DRC, smuggled across the border to a regional hub. So that's classically been Uganda, although recent developments have made that a little bit trickier, as I can discuss, if you like. And then also, Rwanda, Sudan, and then we see it being exported. But first they might buy it a certificate of origin, a false certificate of origin, saying that it originated somewhere where it's more, it's less controversial or not covered by conflict mineral legislation. So that might be, saying it's from Rwanda originally, for example, rather than from DRC, and then getting it, declaring it in Dubai as licit gold from Rwanda, and then, it wouldn't come under the same sort of scrutiny in Dubai. Then it can be declared as sort of scrap or recycled metal or mineral at the gold souk, and refineries might also not look much into it in its due diligence process in terms of where it may have actually come from. So basically this whole system allows it to then end up in the global gold supply chain, ending up in jewelry that you or I may wear, and the like.
Thanks, Elle. That's really helpful context. I think sets the scene really nicely from a financial crime point of view. And I'd definitely like to come back to your analysis of the role of informal mining at source as well later, because I think that's an angle that we definitely should get into the weeds of as well.
Absolutely.
But I think now let's turn to the Russia case, if that's okay with you. And particularly, I'd love to learn more about why there are growing concerns around illicit gold flows from Russia right now, and how worried do you think we should really be about this trend?
Yeah, so basically we started our own research on this, on illicit gold flows before the invasion back in 2021. And so when the invasion took place, when Putin invaded Ukraine, we, and it really put gold on the radar as a potential sanctions evasion tactic, as well as a way of stabilizing the ruble. It really made us think, wow, this research we've been doing on illicit gold feels very relevant all of a sudden to the Russia situation, and looking at how those two situations blend together and coexist, we thought would be really interesting. So yeah, basically, and I think it's important to remember in that regard that this complex illicit network, which we often associate with, as I said, sort of artisanal mining and then going to Dubai, it's actually really open to anyone who wants to exploit that system. So not just, gold doesn't need to just originate from traditional artisanal mining. It can come from, Russian reserves as well. Particularly if it's been labeled as illicit or due to sanctions. So yeah, basically we've definitely seen Russia, just for a bit of historical context, we've seen Russia building up its gold reserves enormously, as you said, Nadia. Basically it's now valued at about 130 to 140 billion US dollars in value in reserves. And we know that, Putin began to really actively expand its Russia's gold reserves, a little bit in the early 2000s, but then really after ramping up efforts after Crimea in 2014. So we really saw that this as a sort of key fiscal, economic strategy on the part of the Putin regime to, and I'm happy to get into sort of aspects of the economic factors that drove this decision, but simultaneously it provided a really nice illicit gold smuggling avenue and a way for, the shadier of the elites to try to keep their assets abroad via gold. But the latest on that, I guess, it really came to this illicit angle became more important to look at when in March we saw the Biden administration and following suit, the other G7 countries and the London Bullion Market Association, they all basically banned gold and sanctioned gold and transactions done in Russian gold with the Russian central bank's reserves. So that really closed a loophole that I think a lot of Russians were hoping to exploit during, maybe some of the oligarchs were hoping to exploit as it remained open as a way that they could get their money out of Russia and continue existing on the global market. And it wasn't sanctioned in 2014. So maybe they were hoping it wouldn't be this time either, but that wasn't the case. And so when that happened, we started to think, okay, this is extra relevant because we really can see that it's used as we're starting to see that it's going to be used as a mechanism for those elites to start tapping into the illicit networks that already exist. And there's already precedent on the part of Russia taking part in these illicit linkages, not so much for themselves, but I would flag the case of Venezuela and the role that Russia played in terms of facilitating the Maduro regime's efforts with illicit gold. So basically in 2018, 2019, Maduro came under heavy sanctions and they luckily, Venezuela had luckily for them, they had a lot of gold reserves. So Russia actually provided charter planes to take gold out of the airlift gold out of Venezuela and basically take it directly to Uganda, where a lot of that refining of illicit gold is known to take place, and then basically provide it back in, and they were able to then use that gold to get euros back into the Venezuelan economy and use it in their own economy. So yeah, we see that they already have this experience. There's no real reason to think they wouldn't use it now that they're under their own gold sanctions.
Brilliant, thanks, Elle, and certainly an interesting prognosis to keep tabs on as the situation develops. So we talked a bit about the role of gold in sanctions evasion, but you also mentioned another interesting trend, which has been the role of gold in stabilizing the ruble. So let's turn to that now, if that's okay, Elle. So yeah. How do these broader economic drivers of Russia's gold policy come into play and sort of interact with the uptick in illicit gold as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it is really important to look at those sort of outside the illicit realm, because while we definitely can expect, I think we can expect, and I think people have been commenting on this, that we can expect elites to move gold out of Russia via illicit channels. I think that we should probably consider this to be more of a byproduct of the current situation, rather than a sort of, I don't think we can reasonably claim that this illicit avenue was sort of the driving force behind the Putin strategy to increase gold reserves. Rather, I think the reserves probably were more of a economic or fiscal strategy to try to protect the ruble in the event of depreciation, which is exactly what we've been seeing when Putin went ahead with the invasion. Gold became very important. So yeah, I think it's really important to discuss the economic factors. So for a bit of that context, we saw on March 28th, when the ruble was starting to crash out, the Kremlin basically announced that the ruble would be fixed to the gold standard, at least until the end of June. But then, once the ruble started strengthening, which it did quite quickly, despite all those sanctions, they reversed that decision. So it really shows that sort of it's because of the ruble. And drawn to the strength of the ruble, or linked to the strength of the ruble. And then this back and forth was followed by, it followed up other efforts on the part of the Kremlin to make sure that to try to strengthen the economy via gold. So just to list a few of in case people aren't familiar with the sort of progression of gold-related policy decisions, basically in late February, right after the invasion and right after the sanctions were applied, the Russian government recommenced the purchasing of gold by the central bank, which they had paused for a couple of years. So this was a pretty clear indication, widely recognized to be an attempt to sort of sidestep international sanctions imposed by imposed. But then they went ahead on early March and removed the VAT tax to encourage, easy purchase of gold in the country. And then they temporarily halted purchases in order to actually meet strong domestic demand. And now we're actually hearing, even though they have recommenced, they've stopped the pegging of the ruble right now, we're now hearing that Putin may actually peg it again to the ruble entirely if it plummets. And that almost seems, inevitable at some point, particularly given, the debt repayment situation and the upcoming May 25th change, which is going to be right now, Western banks are allowed to receive paybacks from when those loans expire from Russia, but that policy is going to expire on the 25th. So we'll see what happens there. But that could cause more issues for the ruble, I think. But yeah, I think, it's interesting to look at that broader economic landscape and consider its intersections with financial crime. And I think one interesting sort of thing to remember is that that may indicate that that's quite a strong linkage that we need to remember is that the fact that Russian demand for gold is still very strong, despite the fact that sanctions are on gold now. So basically, they still want it, even though it's sanctioned. And this could be just an indication of the robust nature of gold, as an alternative safe haven currency. But it also could be indicating sort of the limitations of sanctions in halting those overseas asset flows. So I think it's an important angle to be looking into.
For sure, Elle. Lots to keep tabs on over the next few weeks and months going forward, both on the economic front and the other fronts.
Yeah.
But turning now to kind of Russia's imports of gold, because although it has a large domestic production, also sources much gold from East and Central Africa in particular. Mm-hmm. So could you tell us, Elle, a bit more about what Russia has been up to in Africa and whether we can expect a further increase in the Kremlin's activity there?
Yeah, and so much of, a lot of Russian gold is sourced domestically. They have massive reserves, as we've flagged. But I think it is important, especially from an illicit financial flows angle, to understand their sourcing of, East African, Central African gold, which has been increasing, particularly basically since 2017. And how that's linked to a lot of illicit groups, both African groups as well as Russian armed groups. We know the Wagner group is very involved there. So I think, this is an important one to be looking at. And I think it could become a bigger trend particularly as gold becomes so important for the Russian monetary strategy. There's no there's no reason to think that this will go away. So I guess to provide a little bit of the story, which some may be familiar with, in 2017, we saw Putin really increase his efforts diplomatically with some of those sort of authoritarian regimes, which were gold heavy in East and Central Africa. So notably, he struck up a deal with former president of Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, to secure mining concessions and also to construct a naval base on the Red Sea, which presumably would be a really nice way to facilitate that outflow, airlifting even of gold out of Sudan. And then we basically saw a sort of quid pro quo for basically a mineral for security deal. So the Wagner Group, which is that paramilitary force of closely linked to the Russian state, basically could provide that military or security support, and in return, Russia would, get that control of those illicit gold flows. And a lot of that would have been artisanal mining, all of it basically controlled formally by, various armed groups. And in one guy to flag, who we know is really embedded in that system, is Hemeti, who's basically now actually the deputy leader of the country since there was a recent coup in 2021, or a power grab in 2021. So these relations remain relevant, and actually since the invasion and since that power grab in Sudan, we've seen the Kremlin and the Wagner Group intensifying their activities around those mines, with some pretty disturbing reports in CAR and in Central African Republic in particular. I would flag that, there's been reporting that attacks on mines in order to control more mines in that country have left hundreds dead and thousands fleeing to neighboring Sudan from CAR, all around activity. And we know that the Wagner Group is directly involved in those. So they're really ramping up efforts in Africa, and the timing is, sort of uncanny, shall we say. And I think we can really expect this trend to continue, given how closely Moscow has CAR's government and Sudan's government, other authoritarian regimes in that part of the continent under its influence, and if gold remains important. Hemeti just visited the Kremlin, meeting with Sergei Lavrov. So yeah, we can expect this to continue.
Yeah, it doesn't seem coincidental, does it? Thanks, Elle. So before we open up the floor to Q&A, Henry, it would be great if you could illustrate some of these trends that we've been talking about with a few specific cases. And I know you have some up your sleeve, so maybe we could start with a case that demonstrates some of Russia's activity in Africa, Henry. And I know we've just had a question in as well from Matei in the audience around this, so perhaps we could speak to that as well.
Sure, and thanks very much for that briefing, Elle. Yeah, definitely a tough act to follow. That was fascinating. So yeah, I think what I really wanted to demonstrate was, so Themis, we've developed our sort of search tool, which helps look at a lot of these issues. And we were playing around with it to sort of help illustrate this this presentation. And so, really interesting that we've already had some questions about, what the Wagner Group, what the Russian paramilitaries are up to in this area. So we thought we'd take a look. So actually the main entity involved here is a company called Mero Gold. And you can see actually, I think because Wagner's become quite well known, that actually this company's been sanctioned. So if I just sort of select on it, you can see some of the issues there. So we can see that this firm here, it's a sanctioned entity. But also what we're able to do is map a little bit about how it sort of fits into the wider picture. And I think, this is really interesting context to sort of understand what's going on in terms of sort of state-backed, militia, and the way it's sort of furthering, was certainly the Putin regime's interests at the moment. So if we look, we can see that this particular company, Mero Gold, it's owned by M Invest, which we know is associated with Yevgeny Prigozhin. He is he's the founder of the Wagner Group. But actually, I just want to check out this guy here, Mikhail Potepkin. And he's quite interesting for us because he's the man on the ground when we're talking about what the Wagner Group's up to in Central African Republic and in Sudan. So if we look here, for instance, we can see he's been sanctioned by OFAC. Interestingly, he has becoming quite wide. He's becoming much better known. So it's quite interesting that actually other governments are yet to actually pick up on what he's been doing. And, you'd expect to be seeing him to be sanctioned by, Canada, the UK, the EU, further on down the line. But sanctions alone don't tell you the whole story. And so what we like to do here is we collate pieces of adverse media about the individuals so that we can understand a bit more about their involvement. And so if I click on here, which I've got up here actually already, we can see this article from Rusmonitor. Now, Rusmonitor's a really interesting news site. As I understand it, it's actually financed by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the sort of exiled oligarch who was behind the Yukos oil company. Now, Khodorkovsky's been a bit of a thorn in the Putin regime side for a while, and he actually sent some journalists out to Central African Republic to investigate what Wagner was doing with the gold mines there, and 3 of them got murdered in very suspicious circumstances. So, the reporting we're picking up here is really top notch. Now you can see it's in Russian, but actually thanks to the magic of Google Chrome, we can translate that quite easily. And what we have here is Mikhail Potepkin. So he's a CEO of Mero Gold, which is, as we understand, is the sort of main sort of gold miner that the Wagner Group is sponsoring in Russia. But you can see some other really interesting stuff for him. You can see here he is meeting this gentleman who the US NGO has called a local official, but to me, he looks very much like Omar al-Bashir, the former leader of Sudan. If you see the walking stick and the glasses, which are very much his look. And then we go down here, you can actually see the compound, which is where Mero Gold runs out. And then again, I think just sort of going back to, some of the other issues we're able to pick up on Mikhail Potepkin. We've also can see his designation by the US Treasury. Now, this is really useful because actually OFAC and the US Department of Treasury have done some really strong research into this particular network. And this goes back to the 2016 disputed election when Wagner Group and Yevgeny Prigozhin, its main sponsor, were thought to be behind some of the Russian disinformation tactics, which got a wide press there. But we can see here that actually what we have is M Invest is a Russian-based entity relying on its subsidiary here. And then we can see the two individuals carrying out its activities are Mendel and Mikhail Potapkin, who we've just been looking at. And then just going back quickly, I thought we'd just have a look at Yevgeny himself, just to sort of understand what you can get when you start, looking at people who've got much more of a wider profile. So here we've got his date of birth, for instance. We've got these issues, but we can also see that unlike Mikhail Potapkin, he's actually quite widely sanctioned. He's almost got the full Monty of sanctions here, as well then as the various assets of law enforcement against him. You can see here there's a wanted notice from the FBI for his role in election interference, numerous pieces of adverse media, and again, I think what's really helpful here is we can see some of his associated companies, because the Wagner Group is quite a wide network. It goes from everything from Concord Catering, which is why Prigozhin's often known as Putin's chef, because he provided catering services to the Kremlin, through Evropolis, which was one of the one of the groups which was paying for mercenaries in the Central African Republic. And here we see the Internet Research Agency. And this was a St. Petersburg-based sort of nest of hackers, essentially, who were creating fake profiles, which were being used to drive fake news during the 2016 US presidential election, saying a widespread amount of discord, and hence obviously being sanctioned by the US. And I think really interesting just to understand, if you're treating the Putin regime as very hostile to Western interests, you've got these two big firms here, Internet Research Agency, M Invest, which are both private agencies, but they're both advancing that particular anti-Western agenda. Here you have the Internet Research Agency, which is spreading disinformation. And here you have M Invest and Mero Gold, which is buying up gold mines in Central Africa to ensure that Russia has its finger on that supply, and the illicit actors involved there. And so again, that brings us back to someone like Mikhail Potapkin, who is intimately involved in both, and explains just what a person of interest he is. So yeah, I think we've had a couple of questions already today on this chat about the Wagner Group and its activities in Central Africa. So I hope that sort of provides some more sort of visual context to what Elle was talking about earlier in the presentation.
Thanks, Henry. That's a really powerful visual mapping. I haven't seen that before. Amazing. I know you also had a good example to show us of the kind of gold mining companies and potential links to Russian oligarchs and indeed the Putin regime. Is this something that you could show us as well today?
Yeah, sure. So this isn't one I haven't prepared earlier, so we'll hopefully it'll work. But I think if we look at Polyus Gold, which is Russia's biggest gold mine, it's also listed in Moscow and in London, although I think its London listing has been suspended since the invasion of Ukraine. But I think it's a really interesting one just to sort of talk about this sort of wider network of gold, its links to the Putin regime, and potentially its links to various forms of crime. So if we select Polyus Gold, so this is a UK registered company. You can see by virtue of Companies House, there's a huge amount of information immediately here. So the trick will be to filter that information. But what I do like about this is you can immediately visualize what's going on here with the company. And there's some just quite fun things just to draw out before we actually look at Polyus Gold itself. So here you'll see, for instance, Vladimir Chanukin. He's been in the news a fair bit recently because his wife Lubov's a major donor to the Conservative Party. Again, actually, there's another Tory donor here, this chap, Patrick Clan-William, the Earl of Clan-William. Again, in some really interesting business associates. I think he's a Eurasia drilling company. He was also the head of the audit committee of NMC Healthcare, which was another London listed company, which actually collapsed under the weight of various debts brought out by its internal management. So again, another interesting character. Also here you have Bruce Buck. He's the current chairman of Chelsea, longtime associate of Roman Abramovich. So some quite interesting characters already. But the guy I really want to focus on is Saeed Karimov. So if I pick him up, and then let's hide all the inactive directors, so we just have that. And so Saeed, as you can see, got sanctioned quite recently. So he divested his stake in Polyus Gold, and now we can see Alexandra Beckwith and Sergei Nosov are the sort of two people left holding that particular baby. But the reason I find Saeed quite interesting is just straight away you see his date of birth. I mean, he was born in 1995, so he's 26. And he's running Russia's largest, biggest gold miner, well, certainly its UK entity. And you can see here it's been sanctioned very widely. And I think, if we pull up some of the adverse media, it's quite interesting just to understand a bit more about this particular individual. So we can see here, Rue Compromat. Obviously, Compromat doesn't sound good, so we can have a look at it. And again, we can just translate that to English. And I think what's fascinating is you see in this particular article that from 2015, his father, the oligarch Suleiman Karimov, was handing over a lot of, sorry, you can see here the oligarch of Dagestan origin, Suleiman Karimov, was handing over a lot of his assets to his very young 19, 20-year-old son. And not only just Polyus, Russia's largest, biggest gold miner, but also chains of cinemas, which ended up selling for $300 to $400 million, which is pretty good work when you're still a teenager. So that should be presenting a few kind of red flags about the sort of people in charge of this particular entity. And then we can just look at some of Saeed's associates just to understand that a bit better. So if I add in Suleiman Karimov, who's the oligarch we just mentioned, we can add him in here, and we can just run some checks on him to see if anything interesting comes up about him. As that sort of recent article just said, Suleiman Karimov is a very well-known Dagestani oligarch who's been based in sort of Monaco in the south of France for quite a long time now. And again, I think what you can see here is him running the whole gamut of sanctions from Australia to Ukraine. And that is on for a number of issues, historically and current. You can see here he's a level 1 PEP. That's actually because he's a current senator in the Russian government. And you can also see some articles which are supporting that information about why he's a PEP. We can also look at some recent law enforcement against him. Entertainingly, this one actually, I think, is only a few weeks old. Yeah, so it's on Thursday. We can see that his $300 million yacht got requisitioned in Fiji at the request of the United States. And here we've got a nice picture of it. So that's what $300 million buys you if you happen to own a gold mine, which is pretty interesting. And then we get some of the adverse media articles about him. And as you can expect with someone who's had a very long track record, there's quite a bit out there. So rather than clicking through them all, you can just you can summarize them all here and sort of see the sort of main pieces of information. And what we see here is, there's the French authorities have been had various probes into Karimov's activities because he's been a long-time and high-profile resident there. And then I think if we just go through some of his associations, again, I think he's really interesting. He's got obviously lots of companies. He's a very, very active businessman. But I mean, associated people here, you can see Sergei Radulgin is an associate, a potential associate. And actually, that's from one of the articles, one of the adverse media articles we can see about him. You can see here that Sergei Radulgin is actually a famous Russian cellist who's also listed as the secret caretaker of a lot of Vladimir Putin's enormous wealth. So that's a potential issue of concern, particularly given that there's an accusation that Karimov has been using opaque financial mechanisms to pay money to Radulgin. So going back, that's one interesting guy, but I thought just to sort of finish the presentation, I would add one more person who actually is probably the kind of individual you're more likely to come across in a business setting, which is actually his Swiss or French associate who has found himself in his own form of trouble. Here we are, Alexander Stalltarter, through this particular association with this client. So if we add him in, we can see this individual here. He's associated actually with a Panamanian company called Pasha Global, as well as various other issues. But if we go on to him, I think this is one of the key things I really find doing these kind of searches is he's not a sanctioned individual, so there's no immediate red flag there. Neither, well, actually, he is a pet by association with Karimov, and I think what we're going to find is where this association comes from. So if we look at this adverse media, we've got disordered family conflict on the French Riviera. So definitely sounds like it's worth a read. And so if we go through, again, obviously this is French, so we'll need to translate it. But this is actually a very good detailed article in Le Temps, which is a Swiss newspaper. And what it's talking about is how Stuttharter was accused of essentially being the front man when Karimov bought a French chateau in what was actually a complicated money laundering scheme to get 61 million euros away from the Russian taxpayer. And again, I think that's quite interesting. Karimov has been investigated for this in France. There's various legal cases against him. But he hasn't been investigated in Russia, and that's probably an illustration, again, of the kind of power this particular individual has. And I think just to sort of square the circle, I think what we find is quite interesting is the use of the Karimov Foundation to hide his assets, or his 22-year-old son, the nominal owner of Polyus Gold. But also what you'll see is that Stuttharter has his own association there because he's the chairman of the Karimov Foundation. So again, you have these wide networks of people who are quite obviously interesting and, you know, certainly worth a second look, when actually, which are only a few steps removed from a London listed gold miner with a 22-year-old CEO. So yeah, I thought that would hopefully be a sort of illustration of kind of some of the stuff Elle was talking about, in terms of, you know, even though we're talking about gold, which can be melted down, it's very easy to hide. Actually, when you look properly, there's a lot which can be found out there.
For sure, thanks, Henry. And I think this case is also really good because it sort of shows us the importance of not only looking at the official sanctions lists, but also really at looking at adverse media as well, as part of a solid due diligence package. So that's brilliant. Thanks, Henry. And so with all of this considered and the cases you've shown us, what do you think financial institutions need to be doing to navigate this evolving sanctions and illicit gold landscape?
Yeah, certainly. I think my biggest advice is the information is there if you care to look. And you can't just rely on sanctions. I think, you know, it's really interesting that Mikhail Potapkin is only the US who'd sanctioned him. You know, you wonder what's taking the UK Treasury so long, for instance. So sanctions lists are obviously, you know, everyone has to comply with, but they can be a bit behind the times. And I think, you know, it's that wider adverse media you really need to be picking up as well with your monitoring systems. Just to understand, you know, some of the people involved, particularly, I think, you know, if they are politically exposed persons, if they're active in high risk countries, you know, there's a lot of good reporting out there. And I think actually this goes back to a wider problem we actually have in the UK, which is, you know, I think powerful businessmen using our libel laws to silence people, because adverse media is one of the biggest weapons against corruption and financial crime. And so, you know, we want that to be out there as widely as possible, particularly when it's well sourced. But yeah, so I think that's what my major takeaway I think from this is that the information's there if you care to look, even if they're trying to hide, even if people are trying to hide it using anonymous means.
Great, thanks, Henry. So conscious it's 12:44 and we're coming to the end of our allotted time, but I can see kind of lots of great questions coming in both into the Q&A chat and directly. And I know that Henry and Elle have said they're happy to stay on for a few more minutes to answer any questions, but of course, please do drop off if you need to. So we've got a first question coming in here from John to me directly. And John asks, maybe this is one for you, Elle, what do you think? Could you tell me a bit more about the relationship between artisanal mines and illicit gold flows? How can we tackle this issue of artisanal mining getting caught up in illicit linkages?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is good because I think, you know, it speaks to both the illicit challenges as well as the sort of developmental challenges around gold mining, which I really don't think we can neglect. given the sort of vast livelihoods factor that gold mining is providing, as well as other forms of, minerals and precious stones. So we see a lot of, the classic one is sort of blood diamonds, but other, diamonds, other precious metals, gold, and then historically it was the 3 Ts in the DRC we saw, but famously the Dodd-Frank Act and some of the conflict mineral legislation, we saw cracking down on illicit flows and association with armed groups, which really stamped out a lot of that 3T activity. The problem with that was that it made it very difficult for those with livelihoods reliant on gold and other and 3Ts mining to continue their livelihood. So you need a very nuanced approach to this, I think, in order to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences for those artisanal miners and other traders that aren't really linked to illicit groups. So this is really important to keep in mind. And I think, in our research, I talked to some really interesting people who are really active in this space, trying to figure out sort of innovative pathways to treading that careful line between maintaining important development livelihoods activity, and for that matter, gold sourcing from artisanal sources, as well as addressing these illicit linkages, because they don't benefit the artisanal miners either. Those illicit linkages mean that they get a much worse deal on their end, and often, particularly in new gold markets like South Sudan, as well as parts of DRC, they get a really poor price for their gold from these sort of more exploitative actors higher up in the supply chain. I think one area that gets loads of attention in this way is the need for more streamlined taxation and less bureaucracy around the artisanal gold sourcing licit channels. So we pay a lot of attention to, illicit channels and cracking down on them, and, law enforcement, which is very, very important. But I don't think we should neglect the licit side of things. And there's some really interesting work going on in this space around, I would flag Impact. They're a Canadian NGO, and they're doing really good work trying to assist the DRC government in streamlining their artisanal sourcing of gold in illicit channels, to make it more sort of attractive and feasible for artisanal miners to trade in that system, rather than relying on their sort of older, more historic connections to illicit actors. But yeah, happy to, I think Themis is going to be doing some interesting work, showcasing some of the work of those important NGOs and efforts on the ground there to address that sort of gap in the system in terms of licit channels.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Del. So we have a second question coming in, maybe Henry, for you this time. This one's from Emily. And Emily asks, cryptocurrencies are currently nosediving. What effect do you think this will have on illicit gold flows?
Yeah, no, thanks, Emily. I think that's a really interesting point, given obviously you've already made a connection between crypto and gold. And I think, there's two big things cryptocurrency had going for it. One was its anonymity, and the other was its idea as a huge store of value, very, very similar to gold. So yeah, I mean, I've always been a bit suspicious of cryptocurrency. It felt like it was a good venture to have at a time, of mega low interest rates, when people were trying to find yield at somewhere. And I think now that the inflation's clearly here, and that market's going to change, I'd probably see that going down. And so I think you're going to have more people piling into gold as a way of trying to store value. And I wonder how much those graphs might even actually correlate with crypto going down and gold going up. I also think there's been better regulation of cryptocurrencies, which is probably one reason why it's also proving less attractive. So certainly, gold, the ability just to melt down a bar from anywhere and change it into something else, change it into jewelry. It's the ultimate laundering mechanism. And if cryptocurrency is beginning to leave a digital footprint which authorities can pick up, then that's going to make it much, much less useful. So yeah, I wonder if this nosedive presages a further nosedive. But then I think lots of people said that before and been proven wrong. So yeah, that's probably not my area of expertise. Yeah, so that's my thoughts there.
Definitely one to watch. Thanks, Henry. So another question coming in from an anonymous attendee. What are the implications for businesses if they find that they are either directly or indirectly dealing with sanctioned gold or sanctioned individuals or companies? So I guess this is around the potential implications of sanctions violations.
Henry, do you want to start that one off and I can
add? Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really interesting. I think actually before we were talking about this, there was you know, there's a Canadian gold miner, for instance, and I can't remember its name now, but they are trying to Kinross. They're trying to exit their investments in Russia, and I presumed it's for exactly the same reason, dealing with sanctioned entities. But then the problem is the only buyers they can find for the asset are themselves sanctioned, or, you know, there's various concerns around UBOs of the business. You know, I think in a funny way, we saw a similar matter with Chelsea when Roman Abramovich was trying to divest that particular asset. So I think this is a really tricky time. Essentially, obviously, you don't want to be doing any new business with someone who is sanctioned, and you should be looking to unwind those business relationships as far as is practicable. But yeah, I don't know if you had anything more you wanted to add there.
Yeah, I think, you know, preemptive is always better than after the fact. But I do think that, yeah, I mean, there's always red flags that you can look out for in this regard. It's particularly around gold. You know, I mentioned a bit the certificates of origin issue, which is massive, and I think can go a long way in terms of more due diligence from refineries in particular, looking at connections to you know, potential questionable, and just, you know, raising that sort of question in your mind, does this look right, kind of thinking around those documents, because certificates of origin can very easily be forged. So a more proactive approach to that. There's also been some interesting stuff going around and sort of like digitalization of those kinds of documents and seeing where, and so I think keeping an eye open to the sort of future in terms of the more like technical development around yeah, more scrutiny and more, you know, rigorous scrutiny of those documents. I think there's a lot of potential there, and including around, again, there's been some interesting activity at the source, looking at, you know, sort of tracing using blockchain, more tracing of gold as it moves through the supply chain, because as I said, it goes between licit and illicit, so fluidly. So really trying to use that technology to have more grasp of the supply chain. I think that there's a lot of scope there for that. But I think companies individually can really look out for those red flags as of now. So sort of those certificates of origin, also looking at sort of where the gold has been in terms of where yeah, as I said, like source, transit, and destination. So we know certain places are high risk. That includes those East African and Latin American countries that I've mentioned, as well as, you know, Dubai is a huge hub, and then Turkey as well, Istanbul. And then we've also seen, you know, big flows going to, in terms of destination, going to India and also Iran, Iraq. Those are some hubs that you need to watch out for. And then also I would just say, like, misclassification of the nature of the gold, so purity, weight, origin, value on those custom forms more generally. I think those are some red flags.
For sure, key things to look out for. And I just also wanted to underline, sort of from the Themis perspective, the consequences really of getting this wrong. So if you are found to be doing business with sanctioned entities, the financial, regulatory, and reputational aspects of that can be quite harmful and difficult. But anyway, I'm afraid our time really is running out. We've gone over a bit already, so we won't be able to cover all these questions that are coming in. I'm so sorry about that. But thank you very much to everyone for your contributions. And I'm sure Henry and Elle would be delighted to continue this conversation afterwards and offline as well. So, so this certainly won't end here. And if you'd like to learn more, then I'd also actually really encourage you to sign up to our ongoing Themis sanctions alerts. If you haven't done so already, these are sort of email briefs which highlight new sanctions as they arise and help you understand how you can use Themis Search, which Henry was showing us just now, to identify and investigate if you're conducting business with sanctioned individuals or companies. And we'd also love to give you a short demo of Themis Search or ongoing monitoring as both of our platforms. So do drop us a line about that or book in a session via our website. It's very easy to do. But before we finish up for today, I want to say a huge thank you to Elle and to Henry for joining us and for sharing your insights. I personally have learned a huge amount about gold and about its importance to Putin's regime. And of course, finally, to everyone tuning into this webinar, thank you very much for listening, and I wish you all a lovely afternoon.
Thank you, Nadia.
Thanks, Nadia.